A final whack of the mallet fixed the parchment on the pine wood board as Reuven Silis took a step back to admire his own work. He placed his hands on his hips and proudly looked around himself. The small town of Farwater was hard at work even in the midday sun. Smiths toiling away at their anvils, ranchers from up the hills yelling their cattle back in line, and the gentle humdrum of a small working town doing everything it could to survive the war. Lovely penmanship, a stranger noticed from behind, breaking Silas's peaceful moment. Seems you put a lot of work into it. He turned briefly to look at the man, crossing his arms and letting out a loud sigh. He noticed his ragged coat covering the dark garments underneath. "Aye, friend," he finally answered, after he had finished taking in every detail. "The missus usually deals with these matters, yet I did this one myself." "That's a missing persons notice, I see," the stranger replied, leaning in closer to the board. "Who'd you lose, Mr. Silas?" he answered, extending a friendly, slightly calloused hand toward the stranger. "Reuven Silas, lumberman for the town of Farwater, going on 4 years. The wife's gone missing, I'm afraid, for a few days now," he continued, trailing off. "Callahan," the stranger introduced himself, shaking Silas's hand tight, "wanderer by trade." The lumberman's eyes lit up and he offered a genuine smile. "Aye, not hard to gather, master. You wanderers got a way about you, hard to miss," he said, lowering his head and mumbling to himself. "Terrible the way them lords and mages treated your guild after the incident. Haven't seen one of you since. Used to be your brothers would flood the streets of Port Dawn every passing, always searching for something or other. The city's not been the same since. That's why I left and came here, trying to replace the bustle of the city with a quieter life." "Endearing life story, Mr. Silas," Callahan cut him off, his patience wavering. "Any chance it has something to do with your missing wife?" "None," he chuckled. "I simply enjoy the talking, especially with the likes of you, master. Ones that have traveled far and wide, the stories you might have. Now I've heard you wanderers take on any job to be found, since mages no longer use your particular skills." Callahan smiled and nodded along to the lumberman's words. "You heard right. I assume you want me to find your wife?" Reuven rubbed his hairless head of sweat and rubbed his hands on his pants. Callahan noticed a few burn marks on his fingertips, as if he had dipped his hand in strong chemicals. Strange for a lumberman to have burn marks, he thought to himself. "How'd you burn your fingers?" he asked, curiosity getting the better of him. "This," he deflected, looking at his hands as if seeing the marks for the first time. "Suppose I've burnt them lighting the fire," he dismissed the question, placing his hands in his pockets away from the wanderer's eyes. "Hard work lumbering, you see. Sometimes these small accidents happen. I pay no mind to them no more. Just a few days past, I found cuts all over my forearm, almost healed, mind you. Didn't notice them until then." Reuven fixed his voice and shook his head at his own ramblings. He looked at Callahan. "The job, wanderer. Pays 20 stones. Callahan nodded and gestured towards the shade of a nearby willow. "What can you tell me about her? When did you see her last?" "My darling Layla," Mr. Silas began, with a catch in his throat. "A sweet and innocent angel of a woman. She left for the town market 3 days ago. We've paid for a stall there, selling timber and kindling and all manners alike. Hard work, as I said before, but decent stones. Folk always need their wood. And Farwater is quite well positioned, I might say, friend. No other place to go for a day's ride, even more so with the armies now marching through." "Mr. Silas," Callahan called out the lumberman, feeling his story once again slipping into unnecessary details. "Your wife, she was tending the stall?" "Nay, friend, she never made it to the stall," he answered plainly. "The neighbors said she'd been in talks with a merchant for a few days, and I only thought she was bartering another trade, as she usually does. Can't rightly know if the bastard didn't hurt my sweet Layla." Callahan rubbed his chin and looked away from the lumberman. He allowed a moment to pass in silence as he took in the town. No more than 20 of the houses seemed to still be occupied, and he noticed the same handful of people walking around that he had seen for the past few hours. "Can you be sure she didn't just leave with the merchant? The town's getting smaller, you're in the path of armies. Some people might feel trapped." "Ramblings, wanderer," he yelled out, genuinely upset at the idea. Layla wouldn't dare. Besides, the merchant's still here. He rented a room from the stable master. Reuben stopped short and sighed deeply, as if he had grown tired of his own voice. The stable master? Callahan asked, confused. The lumberman shook his head, as if he had finally spoken too much. The inn closed down before the missus and me moved here. Tavern was burned down last year during a skirmish. Reuben looked towards the end of the town line, to a large two-story building overshadowing the rest of the homes in Farwater. Stable master makes good stones from deals with the western folk. Use them stones to get a bigger house. Only rooms to spend the night in, he owns them. The wanderer tried getting more information about the missing wife from the lumberman, but quickly learned that he was more interested in sharing details about the small town's history, his personal life, and long-winded theories about the crooked growth of trees near bodies of water. After having learned almost nothing of real value, Callahan bid farewell to the worried husband and made his way towards the stables in haste, afraid that Silas might just end up talking until the sun would set. He reviewed all the small details in his head, trying to piece together everything from what little he had gathered. Loving wife, leaves, never to be seen again, last known contact, a traveling merchant. Not much to go on. His mind darkened for a split moment, and the shadow he cast on the ground trembled, as if it were not his own. The echo of a voice rushed through his mind, low and monotone. Dead, the voice said, unsure if it was a question or a statement. We'll see, Callahan answered in his mind as the shadows near him settled. The stables were well maintained, much more so than the rest of town, and larger than half of the other buildings put together. Callahan immediately noticed only 2 horses in the entire complex, though both of them were saddled with western colors. Judging by their posture, he figured that the animals had already seen the war. He saw the stable master, a small man, no older than 50 years old, lounged on a bench in front of the home, working on fixing the clasps of a saddle. Callahan greeted the stable master with a quiet nod. A wanderer. Here, the stable master said, mildly shocked, barely lifting his eyes from his work. Ain't none of those magical treasures in Farwater. Only war. I'm not here for that, he answered, sitting down next to him. I'm looking for someone, a merchant you rented the room to. The stable master put down the saddle and turned towards Callahan, visibly upset. Did Reuben send you? He scoffed and shook his head. He's been pestering my client since yesterday, cornering him in the street, yelling at him from across town, and he hasn't given him a moment of peace. The poor fellow locked himself in his room and hasn't come out since. Callahan did his best in convincing the stable master that he only intended to ask a few questions, yet he was reluctant to listen. He began muttering the same words Callahan had heard many times before from different people. The war took its toll on everyone. He needed to protect his property and his stones. The stables were under the protection of the Western Kingdom, and no amount of begging and pleading could make the stable master cross them. The same exact speech of fear he had heard in every town, all the way from the Western Kingdom to here in Farwater, at the border of the River Reach. When he asked about the only 2 horses in the stables, the wanderer had learned that the army had recently passed through town less than a month ago, and had commissioned each and every animal the stable master had, 18 in total. The 2 left belonged to scouts that arrived last night. The deal, Callahan realized, had put the stable master in a curious position. He had received a large amount of stones for the horses. The exact amount he did not reveal, yet most likely enough for him to either leave Farwater for a better living somewhere else, or change his profession entirely. However, since the stable master was still here, still housing the scouts' horses, meant that the Westerners might have requested that he stay, even though now his trade was that of a glorified horse guard. The wanderer sought to exploit the situation for his benefit. You seem a few horses short of a proper stable, though the town could use an inn, and you have the space for it, he told the stable master in a sincere tone. This was, of course, entirely false. As Callahan already learned, the previous inn closed down, and it wasn't difficult to understand why. Farwater was only ever meant to be a working town, situated on the border, too few travelers, too many soldiers. Running an inn here would be like rowing a boat through a desert. Fool's words, wanderer, the stable master quickly replied, as Callahan expected. Should I also open a nursery while I'm at it? All I need is a few good horses, and I'm back in business. There's some wild ones roaming the fields just past the town border. I just need to hire some cheap, capable hands to help me rustle them." Callahan nodded along with the stable master's words, feigning interest in his business acumen. Fate, or luck, just made it so that he had exactly what the stable master needed. He reached into his pouch and took out a small ring, adorned with a lion's crest atop a green gem. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, extending the ring towards the curious gaze of the stable master. "The Ring of Communion, an ancient trend artifact meant to create an unbreakable bond between man and beast. Wear the ring, speak the magic words of the incantation, and every one of those horses you desire will follow you as if you raised them yourself. It would turn the rustling of wild horses into a gentle afternoon stroll. Not to mention, no need to spend stones on the help." The stable master's eyes lit up and he reached for the ring. Callahan pulled it away at the last second. "It's useless without the words, though, so I propose a deal. I give you the ring, tell you the incantation, and you let me have a few words with that merchant." The man nodded along quickly. "And you're certain it works?" "This is my specialty, a wanderer's guarantee." He extended the ring towards him and muttered the phrase, "Ikni man asama." The stable master grabbed the ring with both hands and waved Callahan away and inside the home. "First door on the right," he said, never taking his eyes off his newly acquired artifact. As Callahan stood up, he could hear the stable master muttering the magic words under his breath, practicing them over and over. As soon as the wanderer entered the home of the stable master, the silence inside stirred the shadows in his mind. "Lies," the voice echoed in his head. Callahan nodded along briefly. "Incantation. Nothing." The voice coiled in his mind as the wanderer smiled smugly. "People hear your language and magic and immediately let go of disbelief. He doesn't need to know that the words literally mean nothing, or that I found a ring in the stream this morning. Hopefully, by the time he figures it out, we'll be long gone." Callahan's eyes went to the room on the right and opened the door. The shadows in his mind swirled as he swung it wide, only to be greeted by a grim sight. A man was hung by his neck from the ceiling rafters, dangling back and forth slowly. "Dead," the voice spoke low again. The wanderer approached the hanged man and examined the lifeless body. "That much is obvious," he answered. "But why?" Callahan looked towards the open door. "You know your patron has hung himself," he shouted out to the stable master, still muttering magic nothings outside. He rushed in, clenching his fist around the fake ring, yet stopped short of the door. The stable master looked away from the body immediately and started whispering every prayer he could think of. "Get him down from there, wanderer. I'll pay you just—" He paused, trying to look back into the room. "Just deal with this, please." The stable master left the house and slammed the door behind him. Callahan shrugged and nodded to himself at the idea of making a few extra stones, and so began his work. He took off his coat and placed it on the empty table outside the room. "We need to look over the room first before disturbing the body," he thought. "These trunks, most are full. Copper plates, candles, herbs, what looks like counterfeit jewelry, even some obsidian. And his satchel, I assume, half filled with stones, and even a trade manifest in here. Towns marked here Farwater, then on to Bloomhaven, Woodsrow, and Meyerfell. Trader was making a good living." Callahan continued looking through the trader's stock, taking note of every item, trying to find something that would be of interest. "Not sad," the voice remarked silently in his mind. "No, he wasn't sad," he answered, standing up and taking another look over the room. "Seems he had no financial troubles. No real reason he would do this to himself, unless he was in debt. We need to look around more." Callahan took a look at the small corner table near the foot of the single bed. On the table there was a bottle of wine and two glasses. He picked up the one that was half filled, brought it up to his nose, and inhaled shallowly, then immediately pulled it away quickly as the smell burnt the inside of his nose. "Poison," he remarked, "highly acidic." He smelled the other glass and the wine bottle. "Flavor's long gone. It's been sitting for a while. Scent of the wine probably covered up the poison." "Clever," the voice echoed inside his head, sounding almost proud. The shadows twisted beneath his feet and settled near the hanging body. Callahan followed them with his eyes, curious. "Notice anything?" he asked inside his mind. "Dead," the voice answered again in the same blunt tone. He smiled at the deadpan reveal and lifted the body up on his shoulders. He untied the knot, keeping the rope together, and laid the merchant carefully down on the floor. Your diagnosis was spot on, Callahan thought. He's dead. He turned the body on its back. Do you notice what stands out? The shadows crept up and settled somewhere above, barely visible. Dead, mortal, fragile. You still have a lot to learn, he thought. But you are right about one thing. We are fragile. And that leaves clear signs. Callahan took a step back and looked over the entire room. Body was hanging in the middle of the room. If he had done this himself, he would have needed a chair, a table, the bed, whatever to stand on. And all of these are too far from where he was hanged. Now look at the marks on his neck, Callahan urged the shadows as he pulled on a loosely tied rope. No rope burn and a loose knot. It means he didn't struggle while hanging. Merchant was already dead by the time he was hanged. He placed a single finger on the victim's mouth and leaned in close to it. That smell, same as the wine. And his lips are cracked, gums are bloody, most likely from the poison burning his mouth. The wanderer stood up and placed his hands on his hips. The only question is why? Teeth, the shadow answered and settled back behind him. Not likely. No signs of struggle in the room, and the merchandise is untouched. No thief would leave a half-filled pouch of stones behind. Callahan placed the body on the bed and wrapped it tightly in the sheets, using the rope to secure everything in place. He carried the body outside and laid it on the bench in front of the house. The stable master was standing away from the door, caught in deep conversation with a woman wearing the colors of the Western Army. Callahan pulled up the hood of his coat and turned his face away from both of them. The stable master noticed him and approached, gesturing to the Western woman to wait. Scouts have returned, Wanderer, and judging by your shy demeanor, I assume you don't want them to bother you. He took out a small pouch of stones and handed them over to Callahan. Where do the townsfolk usually spend their time? I need to learn more about this merchant, he asked in haste, shifting more and more away from the prying eyes of the Western scout. Well, there's no inn or tavern in Farwater, but there's a temple of the craftsman. The stable master pointed south. Just past the tree line, over the small stream, the Westerner scout took a few more steps towards them, keeping her eyes fixed on Callahan. She squinted, trying to make out his face. He noticed the gesture, nodded to the stable master, turned towards the temple and left in a hurry. Just as he overheard the stable master quickly draw the Western scout's attention, muttering something about the army being obligated to clean up the mess in his home. Outside town, just in front of the trees, the wanderer could already hear the gentle flow of the stream. He stopped for a moment upon reaching it and bent over its waters, gently washing his hands. Towns like Farwater have always seemed peaceful to me. You know, I used to dream of moving into a town at the edge of the world. Before everything happened, he spoke into the empty forest as he washed his face. For a moment, just as the water rippled below him, the pale face of a dark-haired woman replaced his own reflection. Open, the voice in his mind asked curiously. Callahan paused and sensed the shadows grow mildly interested in the conversation. He smiled towards the reflection, now turned back into his own, and attempted to connect with it once more. This is what travel companions sometimes do, and we've spent some time on the road together. Maybe you'd like to share something else with me? No, the voice answered bluntly, and retracted back to the shadows of his mind. He sighed deep and stood up, barely able to make out the outline of the temple through the trees. He crossed the small stream and followed the dusty footpath in front of him. Drawing closer to it, the darkness inside once again echoed. Know me? It asked in an ominous tone, sending slight shivers down the wanderer's spine. We're stuck together, and you wanted to learn. I can't only teach you about my trade. Much of human behavior is learned through chat. The shadows crawled back into his mind, and after a brief moment they echoed. Want. Callahan allowed the air to breathe for a few moments and thought of what to ask. Despite traveling with the shadows at his back for almost an entire year, he had learned precious little about it. He knew it was female. He knew she was a Tren, the ones that brought magic into the world centuries ago. And he knew her name, though she had warned Callahan never to speak it out loud. For what reason, she did not say. However, an encounter with the Western military squad at the border left several men dead after he called to her. Callahan learned that day that whatever the darkness was hiding, it was better left hidden. Still, his curiosity demanded answers. Why do you protect me? he asked the shadows, trying to make sense of the partnership. The shadows grew tighter until he felt them right up against his body, almost squeezing him. Mine, the Tran answered, quickly and bluntly. The wanderer looked to the side rapidly, startled by the noise of footsteps approaching. Are you talking to yourself, young man? A woman asked him. Callahan fixed his voice and explained that it is something most adventurers do while traveling for a long time. The woman nodded along, half believing his words, though she still extended an invitation his way. The wanderer recognized her quickly, a priestess of the craftsman, easy to point out by the plain gray silk robes and symbols etched into her hands. The followers of the craftsmen were known for their welcoming nature, a trait Callahan had taken advantage of in the past, opting to stay inside temple grounds during storms to heal or simply rest. The old priestess introduced herself as Heya Jal, serving the craftsman's temple in Farwater for the past 2 decades. Heya? Callahan asked, finding it strange for an Eastern woman to now serve as a priestess. She offered him a kind smile and gestured towards the large stone table at the entrance of the temple. Former Candela intelligence wanderer, she answered directly. A Heya no longer, now just a name. Callahan unbuckled his scabbard from his hip and placed it on the stone table. He unclasped an amulet from his neck, wrapped it in a cloth, and set it next to the sword. Heyajal watched him closely and couldn't contain her curiosity. I gather the amulet is one of those artifacts your guild used to gather? It is, Callahan answered, stepping onto the temple floor. Is it one of the dangerous ones? No, he smiled and turned towards the main altar. It merely takes me somewhere. He bowed to the figure of the craftsman. When's the last time he was actually here? The craftsman? A few years ago, she answered proudly. Before the war started and the residents of Farwater numbered in the dozens. But you're not here to discuss beliefs, nor the gods' trails. I thought your days as a spy were long over. She laughed, genuinely. The training never leaves, though. Now, wanderer, what do you want? I'm looking for information. Layla Silis, the wife of the lumberman Reuven Silis, went missing. She was supposed to tend a stall in the market, though she never made it there. Her husband saw her talking to a traveling merchant, though that turned out to be a dead end, literally. Now I'm trying to find another lead. Heyajal listened to Callahan's words carefully, though her face changed shape at a few key details. Offering her condolences and help with the recent victim, she also pointed out that Layla never tended a stall in the market. According to the few others in town, Reuven Silis ran the business mostly by himself, with his wife only occasionally helping out with transcripts of orders, as Reuven could neither read nor write himself. Heyajal also mentioned how the wife carried herself, a recluse, rarely seen or heard, never stepping foot in the temple, never observing any of the traditions. She seemed to only have a taste for bartering with the traveling merchants that passed through Farwater occasionally, though no one learned what exactly she was discussing with them. The wanderer paid close attention to the priestess and even asked about her former allegiance and if the people of Farwater, a village in the neutral territory of the River Reach, have taken kindly to a former spy that served the Eastern Dominion. Though, as expected, the answer revealed little. As they made their way out of the temple, Callahan collected his items and secured them. He bid farewell to Heyajal, who left an open invitation to rejoin her at the temple after his task was complete. When he asked for a reason, the priestess admitted plainly, I sometimes miss the intrigue, wanderer, and Layla going missing was the only interesting bit of news that came out of Farwater for years. The wanderer started making his way back to town, intent on seeking out the lumberman again for questioning, as he had seemed to forget to mention a few key details. The voice in his head hummed low. Light, it called out, offended. It would appear so, Callahan thought back. Not only that, Reuven now seems more and more guilty. He had seen this pattern before. Lovers scorn, tempers flare. One of them acts rashly, then tries to cover up a mistake. Perhaps the lumberman had learned that his wife had an affair and killed the merchant. But then, why would Reuven even send him to see the merchant? What happened to the wife? Or perhaps the wife herself thought the merchant would expose something more and acted, then skipped town? Always love? The voice inside his mind asked curiously. No, Callahan answered after a brief pause. Not always. Love makes us mortals do stupid things, though so do riches, promises, and words. The shadows at his feet settled before speaking again. Fear? Fear is a big part of it. Not only of physical harm, but of losing someone, or emotional pain. The darkness once more curled up, Callahan's body slightly tense. The husband. No fear inside. He let the words hang in the air a bit as he walked across the forest floor, piecing together everything. Callahan had seen his companions be able to sense when others were afraid, and he suspected it had something to do with her presence in the mortal world of Dremet. But now, knowing the lumberman felt no fear seemed odd. A loving husband, desperate to find his beloved wife, not dreading her safety, didn't quite line up. Now that his hut was within view, Callahan asked his companion if she actually understood what fear is. Mine dies, it answered in a low growl. I end. He tried to stifle the chill that went up his back as he reached the hut. Circling around, Callahan noticed that it was empty. He thought it strange, as the sun had set low enough that woodcutting would be difficult. The town market wasn't up today. There were no other traders in town, and the only place where the townsfolk gathered, the temple, he had just come from. The wanderer decided to enter the house and look around for anything out of the ordinary before Reuven would arrive. Though, just as he opened the door, he noticed something immediately. The unmistakable smell of rot. The home had a single, small room, and despite being a bit messy, it was well kept. And so, even at a quick glance, he realized that the air itself carried the smell, not one particular item. He continued to look around the room, and a few things caught his eyes. A small flask laid on its side had spilled a few drops. He didn't have to examine it to know. The drops had caused the color of the wooden table beneath it to turn grayish white. An acidic solution. Why would a woodcutter need acid at all was besides him. However, it was most likely the same one that caused the burns on the lumberman's hands, and could be the same one that was used to poison the merchant. Then a chain bolted to one of the large support beams in the corner of the house showed faint traces of skin and blood, as if someone was only recently tied to it. The wanderer took a step back as he tried to make sense of it. He let his hand rest on the hilt of his blade. This is bad, he thought out loud. The smell, the chains, the wife's demeanor. I think she's A loud knock interrupted him as Callahan felt the dull end of an axe hitting him across the head. He opened his eyes in the dead of night now, bound to a tree with a sturdy rope somewhere in the forest outside of Farwater, the faint outline of the town noticeable only by the small flicker of candles lit in the homes. He felt a warm streak of blood down his neck as he struggled against the bindings, and behind him he heard whispering, Reuven Silis and a woman, but something else caused him even bigger issues. Callahan felt the shadows in his mind desperately clawing to come out. Hurt, the darkness yelled out. Kill, it echoed over and over, pushing up against his will. Release. But the wanderer did all he could to fight back the darkness. The lumberman approached him, trembling with fear and head bowed in shame. I'm sorry, wanderer, he pleaded for forgiveness. She heard you were to pass through the town a few days ago. Said she had never enjoyed one of you. She was famished. Reuven's wife came into view from the other side as Callahan kept struggling, and he knew his theory was correct, though he had unfortunately figured it out too late. He watched the woman approach him, the unmistakable smell of rot around her, skin pieced and tied together rather poorly, hair sewn together on a scalp that should have been long buried in the ground. She placed a hand on his neck and bared her teeth, preparing herself to finally taste. He struggled and pulled away. Idiot! Callahan yelled. That's a Mascari. It's a fucking mindless cannibal. Release. Kill. Release. Dead. The darkness pounded inside Callahan's head. She's my wife, the lumberman quickly defended. And she doesn't want to hurt anyone. As long as she gets to eat someone every few weeks, right? Did the merchant figure it out? That's why you killed him? The lumberman bowed his head low. He got spooked and escaped. Threatened to call the Westerners to deal with my beloved. I couldn't risk them hurting my sweet Layla. I shouldn't have told you about him, but you would have found him either way. Callahan pulled tight against the ropes, attempting to break free. To no use. Name, the Tren yelled out inside his head. It'll kill you, Reuven. One night, it'll be so hungry that it'll chew out your heart while you sleep. She wouldn't, he defended his wife, holding her back by her arms. You don't know her. She's just a bit sick, wanderer. Callahan smiled mockingly, desperately trying to hold back the shadows in his mind while also squirming away from the Mascari woman silently drooling near his neck, waiting for the chance to strike. "You're a fool. She's not sick. How long has she been like this? Around 2 years, judging by how much of her is missing? That's not your wife." "Name!" The darkness thrashed around his head. Callahan continued to plead with the lumberman, but he was blind to the truth and deaf to his warnings. Finally, he snapped. "Enough, Wanderer," he said, letting go of his wife. "I really wished for a better option." She stood in front of Callahan, teeth bared and panting with excitement. She approached his neck, sniffing the blood, inhaling deep, then opened its mouth wide. The Wanderer stared right at it and whispered, as quietly as he could, "Morrigan." The Mascari stopped short of the bite and drew a step back. The night suddenly became darker. The birds circling above them flew away. The forest critters that ruffled the leaves on the ground scurried quickly in the other direction, and only the darkness and silence of the forest was left. Reuven looked around him, confused, trying to make sense of the situation. He placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, pulling her attention away from the Wanderer temporarily. He squinted to the far side of the trees, and the figure seemed to stand there, still in the black of night. He blinked rapidly and wiped his eyes, then once again tried to make out the figure in the distance. But it was no longer there. It now stood a few paces closer. Another blink and the figure once again shifted, now in clear sight. The Mascari woman leapt to Reuben's side, fixing its eyes on the mysterious dark shape and growling low. Draped in a black robe, a hood over her head masked part of her long, dark hair. Her skin unnaturally white like marble with fine cracks running on its surface, and her eyes, black as burnt coal, seemed to look past everything except the lumberman and his wife. Another blink passed, and the woman melted into the shadows, now growing larger and larger, until they finally enveloped the entire ground that they were standing on. A black void so dense that even in the dead of night it seemed that light itself was too afraid to approach. Reuven Silis, the lumberman of Farwater, blinked again, for the last time in his life. A breath away from his face now stood Morrigan, the Wanderer's strand companion, the omen of death, fear, and darkness. He looked into her black eyes and drew his last breath. Her presence proved too much for his mortal mind to comprehend. He fell to the ground without making a sound, face pale like any trace of blood had left his body days ago. The Tren extended her arm quickly towards the Mascari, attempting to grab it by the head, but it squirmed something fierce in the hold, and Morrigan's grip slipped. Black marks streaked across the woman's face, as though the touch had burned the skin clean off. In a frantic rush, she managed to slip loose and run away deep into the forest. Morrigan took one step towards it, intent on giving chase, before Callahan called out to her. "Leave it," he screamed. "Untie me, we'll get it later." Morrigan approached Callahan and placed her hand on the rope holding him. It frayed away as if it suddenly aged decades in the span of a few moments. She looked into his eyes and he stared back, though the Wanderer showed no fear. Morrigan placed her hand on his chest and whispered, "Mine," before melting back into the shadows of his mind once more. He dropped to his knees and caught his breath before reaching for his gear, thrown on the ground by the lumberman. He looked at Reuven's lifeless body and shook his head. "What did you do to him?" "Fear," Morrigan replied in monotone. Callahan ran his hand through his hair, trying to get the blood off. His wound, however, ran too deep, and so, stumbling for balance, he made his way back to the Temple of the Craftsman, where he hoped Priestess Heajal would be able to help him. As he reached the courtyard, the priestess was already waiting for him, and gestured the Wanderer inside. "Lay down on the bench there. I'll bring some water and cloth," she commanded him. Callahan, already visibly confused and weak, followed the instructions without hesitation. He awoke the next morning to the pleasant burn of the sun on his face. He patted down his head, though he could no longer feel the rush of blood. As soon as he attempted to stand up from the bench, the former spy appeared from behind and pulled him back down. "Give it another few hours," she told him, sitting down near his head. "You got hit pretty bad, Wanderer. Slipped in and out of consciousness all night. Hopefully I didn't reveal anything too shameful," Callahan joked with a sincere smile. The priestess chuckled. "Worry not, I've heard it almost all before, though I still don't know what happened to you. Did you find Layla Silas?" He sighed and nodded along slowly. I did, he answered after a few moments, but I was a few years too late. Heyajal made herself comfortable and leaned in closer. When Reuven and Layla first arrived, she seemed normal, yes? Probably started being a bit more reclusive a couple of years ago? The priestess nodded in silent agreement. A bit shy, but yes, normal. Makes sense. You know who the Mascari are? Heyajal looked away from him, closing her eyes. The cannibalistic demi-humans. Awful creatures. Violent and feral, as I recall. I think there is, or was, a nest of them somewhere around Farwater. Somehow one of them got Layla a few years back, and then it put on her skin as these ghouls do. Probably figured Reuven was an easy target, and so he used him to feed on others and didn't kill him outright. I didn't know the Mascari were so clever. They're not, Callahan said. Usually. The priestess lifted Callahan's head slightly, checking the wound on the back of his head. I used to work with a Hemovari in Candela. Fiercely intelligent man he was. Are you allowed to speak of your old contacts? Callahan asked in jest. He's long dead now, Wanderer. It doesn't make much difference. His eyes grew wide at the mention. A dead Hemovari? Rare occurrence. Heajal grew silent and lowered her head. Not if you try long and hard enough. And they did. The two of them spent the next few hours talking. Callahan complained that he was once again pulled into a job that didn't pay. Heajal kept offering him anecdotes about her time as a spy, and they both joked and shared stories of their past endeavors. When the sun had finally set once again, the wanderer bid farewell to Heajal, thanked her for the help she had offered so graciously, and went off into the woods of Farwater in search of the loose Mascari still prowling the area.